Chapter 7. The frost came early that year. Week after week the weather held calm and cold, with brazen dawns over dark ridges. The fields were grey with rime, lakes and bogs frozen hard. On clear days the fjord was dark blue and ruffled. Then the light breeze died away, and the surface seemed to expand as it turned grey under the frosty mist that came and settled, raw and biting, on the country about the Oslo fjord. One day the sky was sullen. There was a scent of snow in the air. In the course of the day a few hard little flakes began to fall. The snow grew thicker, rustling down with a faint dry sound. Toward evening it fell in great flakes. It snowed for a couple of days. One evening the south wind got up, and then there was driving snow. They had gone to rest early at Hestviken that night. It was 2 days before Lucy Mass. Olav was waked by a thundering at the outer door. He heard one of the housecarls get up and go out. It often happened in such weather that people of the neighbourhood, coming ashore late, asked lodging for the night at Hestviken. So he lay down again, was sleepily aware of folk coming into the room. Someone stirred the embers, rekindled a flame. Then he was wholly roused by hearing his name called. Before his bed stood Torhild Bjornsdatter, with a lighted splinter of pine. The snow lay white on her hood and the shoulders of her mantle. Olav raised himself on his elbow. "In God's name, are you here? Is it Bjorn?" he asked hastily. "'Tis not to do with Bjorn. Duke Eirik crossed Lake Van today, with 500 horsemen, they say. He will be bound for Oslo to greet his father-in-law and return him thanks." "Where have you heard this news?" Torhild thrust her torch into a crack of the wall and sat on the side of his bed as she talked. Her brothers had had a share in a fishing boat this autumn, and now she had been with them out to Teasel, to her mother's kinsfolk there. Thither some yeomen had come that morning, who had fled before the Swedes. They were ravaging the country, plundering both goods and cattle. "God have mercy on the country people," said Olav. "They cannot secure their cattle in the woods in winter-time." "Hestviken lies out of the way," replied Torhild. "Yet I have thought, Olav, it would be safer for your little maids and for the women on our side of the fjord. They say there are German mercenaries with the Duke, so I bade Egil to put in here to Hestviken. I would offer to take them home with me." "You are faithful to me and mine, Torhild," said Olav gently, "and thoughtful." "I was well off while I was with you, and then Cecilia is sister to my son. But what will you do yourself, Olav?" "I will carry the news northward to Galaby." Torhild went into the hearth-room to the housefolk. When Olav came out to the others, he was dressed in a short homespun coat, which showed the leather hauberk underneath, long woolen breeches swathed about the calves. On his head he wore an English helmet with cheek-pieces and gorget. He carried his shield and the axe Kinfetch in his hands. Torhild looked at him. "Do you think Rydolf would try to raise the yeomen to resistance?" "That would be a good idea," said Olav. "There is both the Hole and Oreburg Dale, narrow defiles between the screes, where the horsemen cannot move to either side. The Duke must have thought he could trust to the black frost holding till the change of moon at least, but these snowdrifts will delay his march." Meta Burgersdatter said she would stay at the manor. If the Swedes came, it was not impossible that she might find kinsfolk and friends from the border country among them. "And then it might be of use that I speak with them, that they deal gently with your property. I owe you so much, Olav, that I would like to do you a service in return, if I can." "Don't think of that," said Olaf deprecatingly. It troubled him vaguely that these poor women came and wished to show their gratitude for the little he had done for their welfare, as though it reminded him of old and half-forgotten things, of one who had stretched out his hands to help him, but he had turned away ungratefully. He bade Bodvar arm himself to go with him northward, and went out to the storehouse together with old Tor. They put up some sacks of food, for Olaf thought that Torhild could not possibly bear the cost of feeding so many mouths for an indefinite time. While busy with this, he chanced to knock down his skis which stood in the store. He had used them little since he came south. Folk hereabouts had given up ski running a generation ago. Now it occurred to Olaf that they might be useful. The road from the shore up to Galilee must be well covered with fresh snow. Together with his men he carried the sacks aboard the Bjornson's vessel. She was not so very small. There were 7 men in her. While they were engaged in the darkness and the driving snow, in stowing sacks and boxes, the light of the lantern fell on a big bundle that lay near the mast, well covered over, among barrels and other goods. Wrapped in rugs and skins, Torhild's children lay asleep. Olaf had a glimpse of the boy's fair head. The herring-boat put off from the pier, and Olaf stood a while listening for her, after the night had swallowed her up. The gloom and the flying snow surrounded him like a tent on every side. He could feel the hill behind him, and the homestead under the steep black wall of the Horse Crag in the black night, and before him the pitch-black water swirled below the edge of the pier. The teeming snowflakes sank into it and were gone. He stood there with Bodvar and a strange lad who had been on board the fishing boat. On seeing the master was armed, he had begged leave to join him. All at once an unruly joy surged up in Olaf, as though he were released from fetters. It was dark behind and dark before, and here he stood all alone with 2 armed men, utter strangers, and he knew nothing of what the morrow might bring. Bodvar leapt down into the boat and began to bail her out. It was toward midnight when the 3 men from Hestviken reached Galilee. Through the driving snow they caught the smell of smoke beating down from the louver, and on reaching the door Olaf heard that folk were still up in the hall, drunken men who were bawling and singing. He had to hammer on the door for some time before at last it was opened. He who opened it was a tall, thin man. He gave a low cry of surprise as Olaf and his companions entered. Olaf recognized Sigrid Undset. "Are you come with a message of war, Olaf? Or why are you helm-clad, you and your men?" "You seem to be a soothsayer, priest." Olaf looked across the room. 2 torches stood burning on the long table, and the 8 or 9 men who sat around it or lay sprawling over the board were drunken, every one of them. Olaf knew most of them. They were landholders from his or the next parish. Rydolf Johnson, the warden's deputy, had slipped down between the high seat and the table, as far as his stomach would let him. His big head, with its brown beard, had sunk upon his chest. It was the youngest of his brothers who sat on the floor singing, with his legs stretched out into the straw and his head in the lap of another young lad who sat astride the outer bench, twanging on a little harp. The priest alone was almost sober. Sigrid Undset suffered from the same defect as Olav Audunsson. God's gifts did not bite on him. He was just as thin, no matter what he ate, and just as sad, no matter how much he drank. He stood tense and erect, listening to Olaf's tidings. Olaf had not noticed before that the priest's red hair had become strongly streaked with grey of late, and his narrow, bony and freckled face was aged and wrinkled now. But he was still clean-shaven, like Olaf himself. Such had been the usage in their young days. It was not many of the Franklins they could rouse to sufficient clarity to make it worthwhile taking counsel with them. They had come to Galilee for the settlement of a suit. "Bard, your kinswoman's husband, went home early," said the priest, "and ill it was that he did so. He was the man we had most need of, as a leader. Rydulf is worth nothing." Olaf said they must first send a message in all haste to the town, to the captain of Akershus. "But, sooth to say, I have more mind to stay with you here. If you hold with me that it will be a great shame on us if we let the Duke march through Oreburg Dale without trying whether perchance we may give him some trouble." 50 men should be able to hold the pass a day long against an army," said the priest, "and the townsmen will gain time, if we gain no more." Young Ragnvald was sober enough by now to take things in pretty clearly. He offered to ride in at once. The priest got out writing materials. Meanwhile, Olaf and some of the others went to the servants' room to wake the men there. The snow had abated a little as the body of Franklins made their way toward the church town, but every trace of the road was drifted over. The priest and some of the others rode, so they soon went ahead of the rest, who had to tramp on foot in the snowdrifts. Olaf glided quietly and lightly on skis by the side of the horsemen. Now and again he had to stop and wait for them. He was standing at the edge of a little clearing when Sira Halbjorn appeared out of the darkness. The priest reined in his steaming horse and leaned over to Olaf. "I have been thinking. We are 2 men here who can run on skis. What do you say if we struck southward tonight and scouted around?" Olaf said he thought the same. At the parsonage they came into a pitch-dark, ice-cold house. Sira Halbjorn had been from home since break of day, and his housefolk were in bed. At long last he managed to strike fire and light candles. To Olaf it seemed many days since he took the boat at Hestviken. The night had been hard and long, the sail up the fjord, then on skis, and into one strange homestead after another. It had all taken time. From within the closet Sira Halbjorn called. Would he not rest a while before they set out? But Olaf said they could not afford to waste time. He packed in his scrip some frozen bread and meat, and a ball of butter that the priest's servant brought him. Remembered that he had left home without food or money, thinking he should be back before they took the field. But the very fact that he was now headed straight for warfare gave him an easy feeling. Sira Halbjorn stepped out. He wore a smooth, old-fashioned iron helmet with a big hinged visor and a pitch-black canvas hauberk over the blue priest's frock, which he had kilted up. His sword hung in a leather baldric over his shoulder. In his hand he held a longbow such as the English and the men of Telemark use. The arrows rattled in their quiver on his back. Olaf could not resist saying with a little smile, "You are arrayed to sing many a man's requiem now, father." A tremor seemed to pass over the other's sharp, long-nosed face. "Tempus occidendi et tempus sanandi." "You told me once they taught you something of the Scripture when you were at Hamar in your youth. Did he teach you that saying, the stubborn Lord Thorfinn?" "No, but so much I do know that I think I can tell the meaning. A time to kill and a time to heal." The priest nodded. He bent his bow and strung it. "Tempus belli et tempus pacis." Solomon wrote that in the book that is called Ecclesiastes. 'Tis one of the bravest books in Scripture. But take off your armour, Olaf. It will be too heavy to run in. Olaf removed his surcoat and took off his hauberk. It was of elk's hide, with thin iron plates about the waist to protect his vitals. As he folded it and tied the thongs, he asked, "Are there more such sayings in the book you named? Of war?" "There is one, I remember. It goes like this. I praise the dead, which are already dead, more than the living, which are yet alive. Yea, better is he than both of them, which hath not yet been born, nor seeth the evil work that is done under the sun." Is such the wisdom of Solomon? Olaf slung the bundle of armour on his back, and the two men went out. Now it was snowing again, so that the night flickered about them. He must have said that because he sat too safely there in his castle of Zion, and his days were too full of ease, said Olaf, laughing quietly. Sire Halbjorn laughed too, as he ran and was swallowed up by the darkness. He had to go and find his skis. They had the driving snow right in their faces across the fields, and Olaf had to exert himself so as not to lose the other's dark shadow in the flurry. Sire Halbjorn went forward with long, supple strokes, the points of his skis sinking deep in the heavy snow at each sweep. In the blind night he aimed blindly at gap after gap in the fences, where the gates were in summer. Olaf wiped his face now and again, and his helmet, on which the snow lay melting, sending streams of water down his neck. But he could not stop for an instant if he was to keep up with his companion. Within the forest it was better. Where were they going? Olaf no longer knew. But the other seemed as sure as ever. Sometimes the firs stood so thick that their skis scraped the bare ground when they ducked under the snow-laden boughs. Olaf recalled what he had heard said of the priest, that he was not afraid to hunt in another man's wood. But no one cared to speak of it. Sire Halbjorn raised strife enough without that. Likely enough it was true. The priest went forward as though he knew every turn of the way, in spite of the darkness and the snow. Once Olaf recognized where he was. They had entered a narrow track with a steep wall of bare rock to the east of it and loose stones at the bottom, so Olaf was afraid the skin underneath his skis would be cut to pieces as they struck the bare rock so often. There was a faint gurgle of water underneath the snow. The weather had cleared. High up above the defile, strips of black sky peeped out between light clouds, and a star twinkled. Folk shunned this pass after dark. Any evening the troll's hound might be heard barking among the crags. Involuntarily Olaf hailed the other under his breath. "Are you afraid, master?" asked the priest with a little laugh, as Olaf came up to him. "Not even the troll will turn out his tyke tonight." "I am not afraid either." Olaf lifted off his helmet and let it hang on his back. "Only my head itches so. I am in such a sweat." Sire Halbjorn waited till the other was ready, then he set off again. They went side by side over a flat white surface darkened by patches of water. It was oozing up now in the thaw. Sire Halbjorn stopped for a moment, leaning on his staff and getting his breath. "Are you tired now, Olaf?" Above their heads the clouds were parting more and more, showing deep rifts of blackness and a few stars faintly shining. A deep sigh went through the snow-covered forest around the lake, and here and there the branches let fall their burden with a low gasping and rustling sound. "Ah, no, but I feel I am not so good a ski runner as I was in my youth." "You are not used to finding your way at night time?" "I went once from Hamar town to Mickelbo in Elfadal. I have made that journey many times, but once I did the half of it by night and found my way. I didn't know where I was going." "Were you alone?" asked the priest. Olaf said, "I had company half the way with a young lad, but he was untried, had little skill at ski running." But Sira Halbjorn asked no more. They stayed a while longer to regain their breath, then the priest flung himself forward and they were off again. They plunged into the woods and followed a watercourse. Olaf had to go in the other's tracks, and they ran on and on. In a way he was pleased that the priest had asked no questions, and he felt it to be a good thing that he was beginning to be tired. More and more his body moved of itself. When he was gliding downhill he felt his heart beating less violently, and the breeze was cooling to his overheated body. A little shock of anger ran through him every time a branch caught in the load on his back and gave him a bath of wet snow. He did not know how long they had been going, but at last the night began to fade away. It was in the grey light of early morning, with the sky again heavy with snow, that Sira Halbjorn and Olaf passed along the top of an enclosed field, which sloped down to a cluster of farms in a plain. Olaf was broad awake all at once. Every yard was full of people, men in steel caps, armed with long swords, their horses close at hand, and thick black smoke rolled up from every roof. On one farm farther south a great bonfire was burning out in the yard. Sira Halbjorn stood watching, sniffing at the scent of smoke. Then he made for the alder thicket, creeping down gently and spying out. Olaf followed, excited and wide awake. They came to a rail fence. Before them a great white field sloped down toward the outhouses of the nearest farm. In front of the byre some armed men stood round two countrymen who were holding and flaying a slaughtered beast. Olaf and the priest watched for a while. "Ha! I declare," Sira Halbjorn laughed angrily. "They have forced Sigurd himself to hold the beast, and it is his son that flays it." Olaf knew where he was now. These farms lay south and east of Kamshorn. The village was surrounded by forest, which divided it from the district to the east toward Jarlund Sound. Olaf advanced a little farther along the fence, while he considered which way they ought to take in order to reach the more populous district, under cover of the woods, so that they might have a sight of the Duke's main force. Then he heard the twang of a bowstring behind him. He saw the arrow fly and bury itself in the snow behind one of the men who watched the flaying. Sira Halbjorn knelt down on one ski and picked up another of the arrows which he had stuck in the snow before him. Olaf turned abruptly and dashed uphill toward him. At the same moment the first bolt whizzed past him into the thicket, shaking the snow from the branches. The men by the houses rushed out into the field, but sank deep in the new snow. Then one of them fell. Sira Halbjorn had shot a second arrow. But now he leapt up, and he and Olaf fled together uphill over the pasture. One or two more bolts came whistling after them, but it was vain for the Swedes to give chase to the two ski-runners. They halted a moment and listened. A white clearing within the forest where a few old barns stood. "You shot unwisely, Sira Halbjorn," said Olaf with vexation. "I have hit a longer mark before now," said Sira Halbjorn coldly, "but I sprained my thumb last night, so my first arrow went wide." "That is not what I meant," said Olaf impatiently. "Now we shall have small profit of our scouting. We have seen no more than we knew already, and 'tis most likely they will take revenge on the poor folk of these farms." Sira Halbjorn's face flushed deeply with anger. The veins stood out like cords on his temples, but he received Olaf's words in silence. And so they went on. Now they made for the highway, and early in the day they reached the southernmost farms of Sarna parish. The folk here had already had news of the trouble, and as they came farther north they heard the church bells ringing. By the bridge north of the church they came upon a great body of countrymen, eager for news. It was very mild, and the sky hung low and grey over the level country, but the ice on the river was safe under the covering snow, so it would be useless to try to check the Swedes at the bridge. Moreover, many of the folk from here had taken their cattle with them eastward into the forest tract of Gardar. It lay well out of the way. Sigrid Undset urged the men to go with him and join the countrymen farther north, all those able to bear arms. But it was easy to see that the people of Sarna parish thought things were well as they were. They expected the invaders to march straight through their district without doing them great damage, and they even seemed not to wish that the Swedes would be thrown back. If they had the hostile army pouring over them, smarting under a defeat, it would be worse for all. The rich townsmen, merchants and clerks are much better able to pay ransom than we. Olaf saw the priest was so angry that it would be imprudent to let him have a hearing, so he himself stepped forward and spoke. "Good friends and kinsmen, don't you see that if Duke Eirik gets possession of the castle of Akershus, we shall have this hard master over us all for we know not how long, till the spring at least, and then he will fleece us all to the skin. He has with him 300 German horsemen, and we all know what that means, and he owes them pay. Much better were it that we meet him now and see if we can make him change his mind." Someone suggested that surely King Hakon must come home now and defend the country. The king has his hands full with defending the border by the river. We Franklins here about the Oslo fjord had a name in old time for being peace lovers, so long as we were left in peace. Don't you remember how our forefathers danced more than once with their enemies on the ice outside Oslo? They did not carry off the victory in that dance, Olav Audunsson, a man interrupted. Don't you know that? But they gained by it in the long run for all that, Erling. It is always worse in the end for him who dare not defend himself. And so thickly peopled is the country hereabouts that we should be men enough to bring the Duke to another mind. The end was that Paul Kurt of Huseby and the sons of Berglot from Tegneby promised to follow with as many men as they could raise. Sigrid Undset and Olaf then went on. "Did you not know," asked the priest, "that the king sailed to Bjorgvin before Martinmas? Helg and Count Jacob have charge of the new castle on Bargaholm with few men. Better to let these people think that they have our army at their back." "Where have you heard that the Duke owes the Germans pay?" he asked again. "I have never heard anything else of dukes and mercenaries." Olaf gave a little laugh. "Tempus bellus, was it not so you said?" "Tempus belli," Sigrid Undset corrected, and laughed too. Arrived in their own country, they heard that Bard of Skikjustad and Rydulf, when he was sober again, had given up the plan of meeting the invaders in the Orebike Dale, and had gone forward with more than 80 men to join the men of Ars. They had taken up arms. Folk judged that with the snow in this state, the Duke could not advance farther the first day than Krakstad or Skedis, and so the country levies would wait for him a little to the northward, where the road runs under a little ridge, having on its eastern side some bogs which never freeze till after midwinter, as they are full of springs. There they thought they could decoy the horsemen out into the morass. Olaf was not very familiar with the country inland, but the priest muttered and shook his head when he heard of this plan. They reached the place as it grew dark. In a little hollow on the ridge, the watchman had made a fire. The scouts made their report as they had agreed upon it. They both thought it useless to say they had seen a little of the hostile army. They took off their boots and hung them on poles by the fire, threw themselves down on beds of pine branches close to the crackling logs, where some men had set up a sort of tent of blankets and coats, and fell asleep, dead tired, both of them. It was not yet full daylight when Olaf was aroused as they broke camp. He snatched his boots from the pole above the embers. They were toasted hard, but gratefully warm, for he was chilled all through. He pulled on his hauberk over his coat and ran, axe in hand, to the brow of the ridge. Below him the rock sloped smooth and steep for thrice the height of a man to the narrow road that skirted the bog. Farther on it swung on to the high ground. The slope was not very steep, and the weak point of the position was that at the top of the pass there was level and open ground on both sides, mossy ground with scattered trees. Up here lay the men of Ars and Sana, 100 or more. On the edge of the ridge, stacks of timber had been built. From below, the muffled rumble of the advancing body could be heard already, and the splashing of horses' hoofs in the slushy road. He made out the leading horsemen to the southward. They could ride 3 abreast here. Out on the bog, dark clumps of men could be seen running where the ground was hard. They were the yeomen who had lain at the little farms under the brow of the wood in that direction. At that moment came the first shower of arrows and javelins, but most of the men on the bog had aimed too high, so that their shots flew over the heads of the horsemen and struck the cliff. One fell in the heather about the feet of those standing on the ridge. "Too soon, besides," said Bard of Skiktrostad with an oath. He was standing just in front of Olaf. For all that, there was confusion in the ranks of the horsemen on the road below. Some of the horses reared or tried to break out to the side. Those who rode in the van reined theirs in. There were shouts to those behind, and answering shouts. Then the leaders spurred their horses. It looked as if they would ride on without heeding the body of men on the bog. Great pools of water had formed during the night, disclosing the danger of attempting to pursue the attackers on horseback. But some of them were leaping out of the saddle. They would try a bout after all. So far as Olaf could judge in the grey dawn, the mounted troop was about an old 100 in number. They pressed on from the rear. Some horsemen were forced out to the edge of the bog, and now the leaders had reached the top of the pass. There they were met by the country levies, who received them with spears, axes and swords. And now the shots from the men in the bog began to take effect. Some riderless and wounded horses screamed and neighed and caused confusion as they tried to break out of the ranks, and the cries of wounded men rose above the clash of arms in the pass. Down in the road a loud young voice called out above the tumult. A tall, erect man in knight's armour held in his horse and called for a hearing. When the noise of the battle died down a little, the men on the ridge could hear that the knight was Norwegian. They could make out most of what he shouted to the countrymen in the pass. In the stillness that followed, Olaf noticed that it had begun to rain. The Norwegian knight called out that Duke Eirik had not come to wage war on the people of the country, unless they attacked him first. It was King Hakon who had broken treaties and agreements, both with the Duke and with the Danish king. So now they might expect another raid on that land when summer came. And he had made a pact with King Birger and would lead Norwegian forces out of the country to support the Swedish beggar king who wronged his own brothers. King Hakon had foully betrayed the man he had lately embraced as his son-in-law, and the Duke sought no other aim here in Norway than to come to speech with the king. But so basely had King Hakon outraged his own knighthood, and so harshly and presumptuously did he rule in Norway's realm, that Duke Eirik had found support with many good and noble Norwegian lords, and they looked to it that the people of the land would back their demand for a settlement, "That is Lodin Sigvardsson," said Sira Halbjorn. "Bjarn Foster, a fox and a traitor like his uncle." "Let go now," cried Bard along the line, and the men on the ridge hurled down the piles of timber and stones. There was a smell of scorched rock as the falling mass thundered over the troop of horsemen below. Among the mass of tumbled logs, Olaf saw horses' legs kicking in the air as the animals rolled. There were neighs, cries and shouts in the confusion, and men struggled to get out of the saddle and onto their feet. The road was a crawl, as when boys drop stones into a cup full of earthworms. Then he ran with the others along the edge of the rock and rushed out at the top of the pass, where the first troop of yeomen was now hard pressed and some men lay on the ground. And several of the horsemen had already hacked their way through, turned their horses and attacked the Norwegians in the rear. Olaf had flung his shield over his back and wielded his axe in both hands, fighting among the steaming bodies of horses, while flakes of foam showered over him from the muzzles of the neighing and rearing animals. He seized hold of a bridle, warding off, as he did so, the rider's spiked mace with the head of his axe, pulled the horse down to its knees, and struck at the man so that he reeled to one side. Olaf ran on past the overthrown horse, and several of his own men followed him. He received a blow on the helmet which staggered him, but it glanced off and he kept his feet, fighting, feeling that this was an unequal struggle, men on foot with horsemen against them before and behind. The place was ill chosen. Now the Swedes broke through to the moor east of the road, where the opposing force was thin. Above the din of strokes and the noise of battle, he heard a voice from there, shouting to the men to stand firm. It was that leader of the men of Ars whom he did not know. He could not see much on either side for the cheek pieces of his helmet, but he realized that more and more of the enemy were riding round to the east over the moor. Now the hottest part of the struggle was over there, and behind him his comrades were fighting with their backs to him, and the others who received the advancing enemy, they had the bulk of the hostile force at their back now. The Franklin's effort had collapsed. He saw that, and he yelled with the full force of his lungs, plying his axe like a madman. He guessed that the yeomen on the moor to the left of him were taking to flight, but the little band in the pass, who were now fighting back to back, with mounted foes both above and below them, defended themselves with the frenzy of despair. "No falling back! No falling back!" sang the blows of their axes. Then he saw down the road, under the ridge, a long line of advancing horsemen armed with lances. In the wretched grey light there was a gleam of wet on their steel caps and shoulder plates, on the horses' armour. Further resistance was useless. He managed somehow to hack his way through to the steep side of the road, hooked his axe into a crevice, and got up. Before and after him his comrades climbed, scrambled and ran. Most of them had succeeded in getting up. A little way up the height he stopped and looked back. On the other side of the road the greater part of the country levies were in flight across the moor, pursued by horsemen, and they disappeared into the pine woods. In the road, which was now much cut up, horses and men lay here and there, dark forms in the mud. Some moved and some lay still, and on came the Duke's main force of steel-clad, heavily armed warriors, tramping and jingling. And the rain was now pouring down. Then Olaf ran on along the wooded ridge. Olaf was making his way over a field where some small houses lay down by a brook. Before him he saw a man reeling as he ran. Now he fell and lay still. Olaf stopped as he came up to the man, lifted him and turned him over. It was Bard's son-in-law, the bridegroom of last summer, he saw. Hoskold Johnson pushed him away as though in stupor and sat half upright, leaning on one hand with drooping head. Then he turned around and dropped down on his other side, like a child when one tries to wake him, Olav thought, turning over in his bed and going to sleep again. The snow was bloody about Hoskold. Olav gently raised the other and with some difficulty hoisted him onto his shoulders. It was heavy labour to trudge with him on his back through melting snow over the rough ground, but he got him into one of the houses and laid him down in a little room where two old women sat. Afterwards he could not remember what he had said to the women, or they to him, as he ran on in the tracks of some others, together with 3 men who had joined him by this hut. Now, for the first time, he noticed that he must have received a blow or a kick in the plate that covered his loins. It had made a dent that plagued him as he walked. After a while he came up to a high, rock-strewn moor, where a number of the fugitives had halted. He flung himself down in the heather, leaning against the stem of a spruce, and took some food. Several of the men had bags of provisions, and shared with the others. Bard was there, and Sira Halbjorn, and 4 or 5 more that he knew. In all, a band of something over 20 men had collected. One of the men gave a shout, ran forward to a knoll, and looked out. Others followed him. From here, a corner of the Skedish parish could be seen to the south. Beyond the forest, a column of thick black smoke rose up and spread itself in the heavy air. It was Hestbake that was burning, said the men who hailed from that part. A little farther to the eastward they saw more smoke. The Duke's men must be taking revenge for the attack. "You are sore stricken, Bard," said Olaf in a low voice. Arn of Hestbake, Bard's father-in-law and Olaf's kinsman, was still alive, active and hearty in his old age. And now Olaf had to tell Bard of his son-in-law, whom he had left behind, badly wounded, in one of the little crofts under the hill. But Bard, the silent, good-natured Franklin, only gave an angry laugh. It was raining fast, with a faint rustling sound in the melting snow. The country where the farms were now blazing was ringed in by a thick, dark sky, which lay low on the black woods that closed the view. The men had crept in under the thickest trees, chewing food and sucking at lumps of snow as they talked together. Now they could all see that an unsuitable place had been chosen for the attack. Orabake Dale would have been much better, with the narrow bridle path between screes in the glen. But those whose homes lay nearest the forest there would have been loath to provoke the hostile army before it had left their district behind. Then it was said that the stacks of timber should have been saved till the mail-clad horsemen came up, and one man asked why the scouts had not reported that the force contained such a troop. Olaf had just been thinking that had they known that, then... But it was Sira Halbjorn's fault, so let him reply. But the priest said merely that these mercenaries must have lain at farms farther south than he and Olav Audunsson had been able to penetrate. The men cursed a little, others swore roundly. Sure enough, the Duke himself had been with that troop. Then there was talk of what should be the next step. Most of the men were inclined to make for home and see how it fared with their farms. Then Sira Halbjorn spoke up. "It is not to be thought that the Duke will be suffered to plant himself in Oslo without any trying to disturb him. If he sits down before the castle of Acre, he will scarce take that so soon. Munin Bardson is neither a fool nor a coward, and he has a good following with him. It seems to me, then, that the best we can do is to make our way eastward to Ejvatn, and thence up to Suderheim. Haftor, the king's son-in-law, and his brothers are brisk lads and the right ones to lead if there be a levy. Haftor, I know, will scarcely weep so sorely if he loses the chance of calling Duke Eirik brother-in-law. At Suderheim they were but middling glad when the king betrothed to him the Lady Agnes's little sister." Some young lads came climbing up from the wood, supporting among them an elderly yeoman who was bleeding like a pig. While some men, the priest among them, were tending the wounded man, one of the lads asked for Olav Audunsson of Hestviken. Was he here? At first Olaf did not recognise the young man, but then he saw it was the lad who had leapt ashore from the Bjornssons' fishing boat and had gone with him to Galaby. Now the boy asked what Olaf purposed to do, and whether he might join with him. Olaf said he might indeed, but he had not brought more with him than what he stood up in, and he for his part would follow Sira Halbjorn's advice and betake himself to the Johnsons of Suderheim to see whether the men of Raumarik would try to drive the Duke out. The stranger said that was to his mind. His name was Aslak, and he was a son of Gunnar of Ytterdal in Rumedal, but he had 3 brothers older than himself, and so his parents desired that he should enter a monastery. He had now been for 3 years, since he was 13, with the White Friars at Tunsberg, for Father Sigurd Knudsen was his uncle. But he was not made for a monk. Indeed, most of the time he had spent on one of the convent's farms at Anderbu, and now he had leave of his uncle to return home. So when I heard of the raid, and they spoke on board of putting into Hestviken, and I saw you were in war harness, Uncle had spoken of you. You and he are friends, I think. Did Father Sigurd speak of me? Asked Olaf, rather incredulously. I have seen him when I had occasion to go thither, but never have we exchanged many words. I cannot guess why he should speak of me. He said you were a bold man, and had fared much in foreign lands. He told me you were fostered in his home country at Fretterstein, and had made your marriage there. Olaf made no answer to this. He never liked to hear of his young days, or to meet with men from the uplands who knew of him from that time. That Father Sigurd of the Premonstratensian convent had kinsfolk in that part of the country he had never known, but this seemed not to be worth a thought now. He asked Aslak where he had been during the fight in the pass, and let the lad talk, but said little himself. He was rather tired too, and wet to the skin. He now felt his head aching from the blow he had had on his helmet, and his boots had rubbed the skin off his feet. Soon after midday the party on the hill broke up. Most of them were going home, among them Bard of Skiktorstad. He wished to see to his son-in-law. But 11 men started eastward, led by one from the Skedish parish, who was to guide them through the forest to Eyjavatten. There were Sira Halbjorn and Olav Audunsson, Marcus and Simon, sons of Alf of Berg, and a stalwart young franklin whom Olaf did not know. The rest were housecarls, and then there was this lad, Aslak. Within the forest a few more men joined the company, and there was talk of the fight. But no one knew anything certain as to how many of the country levies had fallen, or how many men the Duke had lost. One party of the horsemen had turned back, plundered and burnt some farms, but they had not given themselves time to range far afield. Soon all talking ceased. The little company tramped in single file up and down the woodland, over and around low pine-clad heights, in thick wet heather and sodden snow. On the tarns the slush was ankle-deep above the ice, and the rain poured and poured from a grey sky. At dusk they reached houses and cultivation. Before them lay the lake, Eyjavatten, a wide grey surface under the darkening, rainy sky. No one here had heard the least news of the troubles, and the people of the manor, where they asked shelter for the night, sent a messenger at once to the knight at Ormberg. War arrows were sent out, and men went up to light the beacon. By next day they had assembled a band of over 80 men, who marched northward across the slushy surface of the lake on foot, on horseback, and in sleds.